Hi, this is the video lecture on social structure and institutions. So the overall takeaway from this topic will be about how these two things contribute to stability in our society. When you think about it, there is a lot of repetition in our daily lives, not only in how we as individuals go about our daily lives, but also the lives that we see happening, unfolding between people. And the reason why we see this repetition is because of social structure and social institutions. So the book talks about different statuses. Statuses are one component of social structure. I'm not going to spend too much time describing them here. I will say that statuses are basically just positions we occupy in life. These are the labels we place on ourselves or that other people place on us. So there are two different types of statuses. We have ascribed statuses. Those are the labels or the positions that we are born into. Sex is a good example of this. And then we have achieved statuses. And much like the name suggests, these are statuses, these are positions that we achieve. College student would be a good example of an achieved status. Now, another type of status that MacIntyre talks about that's a little bit more confusing is that of a master status. So here's the thing about those. This is a status that acts as a filter to all other statuses a person occupies. So for example, sometimes you hear people refer to a female professor instead of just professor, or a black doctor instead of just a doctor. And in those instances, the statuses of female and black, both of which are ascribed, act as a master status to that second one in the reference. Now, sociologists consider master statuses to be problematic for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, in America, we like to think that what we achieve is more important than the characteristics that we're born with. And master statuses, much like the examples that I just mentioned a moment ago, really contradict this, right? They're very contradictory to this idea. Secondly, master statuses also reinforce the idea that, for example, male professors and white doctors are the norm. So very rarely will you hear somebody say something to the effect of, my doctor is white or my professor is male. And the reason why that's the case is because perhaps unconsciously we still expect our doctors to be whites and our professors to be men, white men in both of those instances. That is the cultural expectation. And so whenever we refer to these achieved statuses using an ascribed status first, we're kind of reinforcing that norm, right? Saying that my professor is different than what we expect her to be. It's important to consider questions such as, where might these expectations come from and what are the consequences of these expectations? And we'll talk a little bit more about this when we get to Unit 3. Now, moving on, roles are expectations of behavior associated with a status. So you can think of these as norms, something we learned about in our culture topic, except they're attached to a particular status. And that's essentially what social structures are comprised of: repetitive statuses and roles. Now, these roles and statuses become extremely patterned in our lives. We act the same way based on our statuses day in and day out. When we see this pattern, we refer to it as structure. These statuses and roles structure our identities and our interactions. So the roles associated with status can have a great deal of influence over our lives. When I teach this topic in the classroom, I usually begin by asking students to make a list of different statements that begin with I am a, and I'm essentially asking them to list different statuses that they occupy. So for example, I would say I'm a professor, I'm a partner. I'm going to take a few seconds to think of what your list might look like. Okay, I think that's sufficient time. Now, more than likely, most of you included a statement about your status within a family. So I suspect most of you said something to the effect of, I am a daughter, I'm a son, I'm a sister, I'm a brother, something along those lines. And many of you probably also said something about being a student, right? I am a student. Now, the fact that there's so much repetition in the statuses that we occupy as individuals suggests that there is something structuring our identities and our behaviors, right? Again, this is getting to the structure of our society, this invisible force that kind of guides us through life. Now, I mentioned a moment ago, another thing to consider when thinking about statuses and roles is the degree of influence they have on our lives. The degree of influence the roles associated with certain statuses have on our lives. So some of you may have picked up in the introductory video that I refer to David as my partner rather than my husband. I tend to refer to him more often when I teach face-to-face classes, and those students definitely wonder what's going on there. Why do I call him my partner? And in a lot of ways, the reasons why I do so relate to this very topic. So I will say the primary reason was originally because from my perspective, the statuses of wife and husband were privileged once only legally afforded to those in straight relationships, and so my usage of the term partner was a way to challenge that privilege. Now that gay marriage is legal, I still continue this practice for a couple of reasons. So one, it's because I try to use non-gendered language in general. We'll talk about this explicitly when we get to gender inequality in Unit 3. But as it relates to what we're talking about in this video lecture, the reason why I prefer to refer to David as my partner is because the statuses of husband and wife have roles associated with them that can exert a great deal of power over a relationship. Now, historically speaking, for marriages in the U.S., the roles associated with the statuses of husband and wife have been inequitable. There's been a degree of inequality associated with those expectations we have of husbands and the expectations we have of wives. Now, David and I strive towards an egalitarian relationship, and so from my perspective, use of the term partner helps to destabilize those traditional power roles associated with the status of husband and wife, and destabilize the influence those roles might have on our personal relationship. Okay, now on to social institutions. Social institutions are pattern structures and values that respond to societal needs. So social structures are essentially nested within social institutions, although here's where it gets a little bit tricky. Not all social structures are a part of a social institution. So when we see consistency between structures and roles across different social settings, this is a social institution. So let me give you an example. Hopefully this will provide some clarification. So what it means to be a student, that status, and the roles associated with it are largely the same in North Carolina as they are in California. Now, this is because of the social institution of education. So we see similarities in the statuses and roles in that social structure across different social locations. That makes it a social institution. However, if you think about the different statuses and the different roles associated with them in your peer group, in your friend network, these likely aren't the same ones found in someone else's peer group. Now, this is because peers is not a social institution, right? Because we do see that variation. Now, something else to note about social institutions is the idea that they have their own cultural values. So when we look at our social institutions, we can read them as indexes, thinking back to a term we talked about in Unit 1. That is, they represent the values we hold in our country. So for example, the social institution of education suggests that we value equality, that every student is going to be treated equally or be afforded the same education. Now, I will say this is an extremely idealized version of the social institution of education in the U.S. There are a variety of ways in which we see inequality playing out. We'll talk more about that in Unit 3. But for now, that's all that I have in regards to social structure and social institutions. If you have any questions, please let me know. Thanks.